Okay, now we're going to talk about pivot tables, in particular how to create a pivot table with VBA code. So let's say we're given some data and we work at a sporting goods store that sells a bunch of products. And this data is just the dates that these people bought the products and what price they bought the products for. So on 1/2, George bought a shirt and it was $11. And on 1/5, Mark bought pants and they were $14. Now let's create a pivot table so that we can see this data in a better light. And a pivot table just looks like this. In case you don't know, if you go to Insert Pivot Table with your cursor in the data, it'll bring you to this Create Pivot Table window, and you can put in a range of data that it already has selected, so you don't really need to change this. And then you can select where do you want your pivot table. Let's say I put it down here, and I click OK. Now you can drag the fields, the column names here. There are fields in the pivot table, and you could drag them down here, and you could sort of pivot on them. That's why it's called a pivot table. So you could create a report basically where you can pivot on all these different fields. And so you can have the pants or the products going down like this as the rows, and the dates going across as the columns, and then the price that people paid for these things is what is being aggregated here in the middle. It's the sum of the price. You can see that here. And you also have this top filter where you can filter on the person. If you select multiple items, you can filter on the person who bought the stuff, and it'll shrink down and only show you the data for those people. So right now I'm only looking at Bob and Dan, and this is what they bought on all the days 1/1 and the products they bought. So that's all a pivot table is. A couple things to note is that you have these fields over here that we're going to use, these pivot fields, and then down here this is sort of the orientation of the report. Um, this is like row fields, these are column fields, these are report fields, or like you could think of them as page fields. And then this is your data field. Like this price here is what the data is being aggregated against. What do you want to see in relation to this data? Well, I want to see the price. So I'm seeing the price when I pivot on the product and the date. That's what I'm doing. So this is like the orientation down here. So let's write some VBA code that will allow us to sort of manipulate this whole process of creating a pivot table and setting orientations and dealing with fields and all that stuff. So I'm just going to delete this pivot table. And what I want to do is I want to declare a dynamic range first. And the reason I do this is because what happens if tomorrow you get more data and your data goes down here, like 1/5/2013, Joe, t-shirt, $43 or something. What if you get more data? Well, you want to be able to handle the size of this data increasing or decreasing and things like that. So if you get more data, you want to be prepared. To do that, let's create a named range, and to do that we'll name a range called data, and I did that on this formulas name manager. And then here's what I can do. I can do equals offset A1 comma 0 comma 0 comma count A. Count A is going to count the number of cells in that column, and then another count A, the number of cells in this row, the top row. And I could click OK. And now data refers to my data here. And if I insert a row, watch, if I insert a row, 1/5/2013, Tom ball 50, if I look at my data named range here, it accounted for that increase in the size of the entire range. So that's just something you want to be aware of when you're dealing with data. You want to be able to use a named range so that it accounts for adding new rows. Once we do that, let's start writing some code. So I have a module here called pivot tables, and I'm going to write a subroutine called make a pivot table. And I'm going to declare some object variables, and we know what those are. Those are just the objects Microsoft provides to us, or the classes Microsoft provides to us. We're just declaring instances of those classes. So here's a couple classes Microsoft provides to us. dim pt as pivot table, and dim cache pt as pivot cache. So we can start there, and what I want to do first is select the right worksheet. So I'll do sheets pivot dot select, and then I will do set pt equal to yes, active sheet dot pivot tables. Actually, I won't do this one yet. So all I want to do is select the sheet right now, and now I want to do this: set cache pt active workbook dot pivot caches dot create Excel database. So what I'm doing now, this cache pt, that's basically the data you're going to use for your pivot table. You're telling it what kind of data is it and where's it coming from. So this the first parameter in this pivot caches dot create is a source type, and you have different source types. Like, you can source your pivot table from Excel data, and that's what we're going to do, or external data, or another pivot table, or a scenario. We're going to do Excel data, so I'll just do Excel database, and then you want to give it the source data. And since we named our range data, I'm just going to say we are going to use that name range. So this here sets source of data for pivot table. Now that we have our cache set, and they just call it cache, you could think of it like that's the data for your pivot table. They call it cache. No big deal. Now let's create the pivot table by doing this set pt. Notice pt is declared as a pivot table object, equal to active sheet dot pivot tables dot add. So when you create a pivot table, you're adding it to the active sheet. So you're adding it to the collection of pivot tables that are already on the sheet, and you want to pass in a cache. So there's our cache pet, and you want to pass in where do you want to put it. So I'll put it in like range K1, and then you want to give it a name. So here's my name, my PT. So right now we have a pivot table. We just created a pivot table. To create a pivot table, you need a pivot table object and a pivot cache object. The cache object, you set that object before you set the pivot table, because you need the cache object here when you make the pivot table. And the cache object is, again, just the data, and then you can create it. So if I run this now, let me get rid of this locals window. there's my pivot table. I just ran it, and you could see it's a pivot table. But a couple things you want to note is every time we run this code, we want to create a pivot table. So if I do this again, I get an error because I already have a pivot table on the sheet called mypt. I can't add another pivot table called mypt. So somehow we need to delete the pivot table initially, and let's do that up here. We will do active sheet dot pivot tables mypt dot table range 2 dot clear. So this is going to delete the pivot table. Now I can run this and it keeps running. You see that? I don't get an error because when I run it, I delete the old pivot table. This deletes old pivot table. Then I can create a new one here. And the reason you're doing this is because if you get 100 more rows, you want to delete the old pivot table and update it with the new data. So now we have our pivot table, but the orientation, we didn't set the row and column fields and all that. Let's do that now by doing something like this. With PT, and then you're going to need an end with. So now remember these with statements, they're just saying with this object do something. And we can do things like dot pivot fields and then date, or we could set the orientation equals XL row field. So we'll make date a row field, and we'll also make column or product a row field. And let's make name a page field, and let's make price a data field. So this is setting the orientation like we saw before when I showed you what a pivot table is. All this does here, set the orientation of the fields. So once we do that, if we run it, let's see what we get. Name is a page field. You can see that. Name, the pivot field's name, dot orientation, that sets name up here as a page field. And then we have date and product are row fields, and price is the data that we're looking at here. And you could play around with this, but remember what we did before. We set this to the classic view because I didn't like this view. I don't like how that looks. So let's set it to the classic view by doing this. By doing dot row axis layout equal to, you don't even have to equal to, XL tabular row. So if we run this now, notice the layout changed to the classic view because of this line. Let's also set a format for the number. So let's do that by doing dot data body range dot number format. Number format is equal to number sign, number, dot, oops, number dot 0.00. So what am I doing here? Price is going to be our data, and I want to set a data body range. So this is like with the data in your pivot table. In our case, it's price. Set the number format equal to this format. So if I run it now, oops, I have some error here. When I ran that, you can see the number format changed to be exactly what I wanted, the decimals with 2 zeros. And then you can even do something like this, like there's such things as calculated fields, and you could do something like this, pivot fields commission dot orientation equal to Excel data field. Oops, I need to do something up here. So if you want to add a field that's not in your data set, you can do that, and we'll do that right now by doing this, like dot calculated fields dot add, and then you give it the name of the new field and what the actual calculation is. In our case, let's do price times 10%. So we'll have a commission here. Up here there's no commission field, but you can make a field that will multiply this price times 10%, and then you could put it in the data field if you want. So when we run it now, look what we have. We have this sum of commission, and that's because down here in the data field, for that basically goes into this values box down here, we have price and commission. This commission is a calculated field that we created in code in just these 2 lines. So these 2 lines created what we saw in that pivot table. So there we have our pivot table created from this data. If I go to the code and I run it again, look what's happening. It's deleting. If I step through this, watch what happens. Right here, it deletes the old pivot table. And if you're wondering, like, what is mypt? ActiveSheet.PivotTables mypt.TableRange2.clear. Well, this is just it's going to delete this pivot table, mypt. Well, where's mypt? If you go to right click on the pivot table and go to pivot table options, you can see the name. The name is mypt. And why is it mypt? It's because when we create our pivot table here, we give it the name mypt. So this is just deleting mypt, and if I step through it, there you go, it's gone. And then we set a cache equal to our data, and then we create the pivot table with this cache, and then we set the orientation, and you could see the orientation being set here. As I step through, you could see how it's changing. The orientation changed. So let me change these numbers. If I change this to 200 or 2000, and this to 4566, and this to 9000. Now for this, Mary and her glasses on 1-3. Oh yeah. So here's those glasses. If we run that again, if we run this again, now you get updated data, and your glasses are here and they're 9,000 now. So this is how you would create a pivot table from data, and the data can change dynamically. So what are the key things to take away from this video? Well, a couple things. One is this name range. This is a name range, and this is a dynamic range, so it's very flexible. It's better than hard coding a range like A1 to A100,000. It's better than that because you might go to, your data might come in and it might go to 20,000 instead of 10,000. So do a named range, and remember we did that through this formulas name manager data. Here's the formula for that. So once you have your name range, all you need to do is use that, your range of data, and set that to the cache PT, the pivot cache. Up here, here's a pivot cache object. You set that cache PT, the pivot cache object, equal to, Excel database, the range of your data, and then you use that cache PT to create the pivot table on your worksheet, and you tell it where do you want to put it in range, where do you want to put the pivot table in range K1, what do you want to name it, and then you just change the orientations. You make it the classic view if you want, you don't need to do that, and then you can change formats of fields. In this case we change the format of the data that we were summing across, and you could even add calculated fields here too. Well, one thing also is that what was I going to say? We are using these objects, and these objects are classes. Remember, like if I put pivot table in here in the object browser, here's the pivot cache class. There's pivot cache, there's the create pivot table. So remember what you're doing here. I want to always remind you that you're working with objects, and this create pivot table is a function. Oh, we're not doing the create pivot table. We're doing pivot tables.add here. Let me see in here. Here's pivot tables. Pivot tables.add. This is what we're using. We're using the pivot tables class and the add function. This is what we're using in our code. I just want to remind you that these objects are instances of classes. In this case, instances of the pivot table class here, and the pivot cache class over here. And we're using the members of those classes. So keep that in mind. In the next video, we're going to do some cool stuff. Now that you can create a pivot table, we want to be able to loop through and only turn on certain certain items of these fields, and we'll do that in the next video.